deep beneath our feet, in layers of rock that have been quietly compressing for tens of millions of years. The Earth keeps a kind of diary. It is not written in words. It is written in chemistry. Every so often, geologists open a page of that diary and find something strange sitting there. A signal that does not quite match anything else around it. Tonight, we are going to look at one of those strange pages together, slowly, and follow it wherever the evidence actually leads. The story starts with something small and almost boring sounding. Carbon isotopes. Carbon, the element that forms the backbone of every living thing, comes in a few different versions, called isotopes, that are chemically almost identical but differ slightly in weight. There is a common, lighter version and a much rarer, heavier version. Living organisms have a slight preference for the lighter kind. Plants take it up more easily during photosynthesis, and that preference passes up through the food chain into animals, into soil, into anything that was ever part of a living system. This means that carbon which passed through life, whether it became coal, oil, wood, or simply decayed plant matter, carries a distinctive signature, a slightly higher proportion of the light isotope than carbon that came from deep inside the Earth, released by volcanoes, which tends to carry more of the heavy isotope. Geochemists have understood and measured this difference for decades. It behaves almost like a blood type. If you find carbon in the rock and measure its isotopic ratio, you get a strong hint about where it originally came from, whether it once passed through something alive, or whether it welled up from the planet's interior with no biological history at all. With that simple idea in mind, we can turn to an event that happened about 56 million years ago, an event geologists call the Paleocene Thermal Maximum, usually shortened to the PETM. It is one of the best studied rapid climate events in the entire geological record, and it is not a fringe or disputed topic. Thousands of peer-reviewed papers have examined it, using core samples pulled from ocean floors all over the planet. Here is what happened, as best as scientists can reconstruct it. Over a span of a few thousand years, which sounds long to us, but is essentially an instant in geological time. Somewhere between roughly 2 trillion and 8 trillion metric tons of carbon entered the atmosphere and oceans. Global temperatures rose by somewhere in the range of 5 to 8 degrees Celsius. Ocean chemistry shifted enough that a large portion of deep-sea organisms, creatures that had been stable for tens of millions of years, went extinct. It then took the planet roughly 200,000 years to find a new, stable climate state, the part of this story that keeps researchers occupied. The reason it still generates papers today is the isotopic signature of that carbon. It looks biological. It looks like carbon that once passed through living organisms, the same kind of signature you would expect from burned or decomposed organic material. Similar in character to what we see today from the burning of fossil fuels. Although 56 million years predates any human industry by a wide margin, the scientific puzzle is where all that carbon came from, and more specifically, whether the known natural sources can fully account for the volume involved. There are 3 broad candidates that scientists have proposed and continued, refining for more than 30 years now. The first is volcanic activity, specifically a period of intense volcanism associated with the opening of the North Atlantic Ocean, where magma intruded into carbon-rich sediments and baked out large quantities of carbon dioxide and methane. The second is the release of methane from frozen deposits on the ocean floor called methane hydrates or clathrates, which can be destabilized by even modest warming and can release large amounts of carbon with a strongly biological isotopic signature, since the methane itself was originally produced by microorganisms long before. The third involves feedback loops, including the burning of peat and vegetation on a large scale, and shifts in ocean circulation that could have released carbon stored in seafloor sediments. When researchers add up the plausible contributions from all three of these mechanisms, using the ranges allowed by current models, the totals in many published estimates fall short of or sit right at the edge of the observed carbon input. This is a genuine, openly discussed area of ongoing research, not a hidden secret. It appears directly in the scientific literature, in papers that ask, quite plainly, whether current models fully explain the magnitude of the PETM carbon release. It is worth pausing here and being precise about what this open question does and does not mean. It does not mean scientists have run out of natural explanations and are quietly stumped. It means that pinning down the exact combination and relative size of several interacting natural processes, operating 56 million years in the past, is difficult, and that different models produce different answers depending on their assumptions about melting rates, volcanic output, and feedback strengths. Most researchers in this field expect that as models improve and more sediment cores are analyzed, the remaining gap will most likely be closed by some combination of the mechanisms already known, rather than by anything unaccounted for. That is the ordinary, unglamorous way that scientific puzzles like this usually resolve. That said, the PETM's open questions did inspire a genuinely interesting thought experiment, one that is worth understanding on its own terms, carefully, without overstating what it claims. In 2018, a NASA climate scientist named Gavin Schmidt and an astrophysicist named Adam Frank published a paper posing a question that sounds almost like science fiction, but is really a question about the physical limits of the geological record itself. If an industrial civilization, comparable in scale to our own, had existed on Earth many millions of years before humans and had since vanished, would there be any way for us to detect it today? It is important to be precise about what this paper is and is not. It is not a claim that such a civilization existed. Schmidt and Frank were not proposing that PETM was caused by an earlier civilization, and they said so explicitly in their own writing. What they were doing was something more like a rigorous exercise in detection limits. The same kind of thinking that goes into asking how far away a radio signal could travel before it becomes undetectable, except applied to geological time instead of distance. Their reasoning goes like this. Most physical evidence of a civilization degrades remarkably fast by geological standards. Concrete and steel structures break down within a few thousand to a few tens of thousands of years without maintenance. Plastics persist longer, but even they degrade within a few 100,000 years. Even highly durable materials like nuclear waste, with isotopes that can remain detectable for millions of years, eventually fade into ambiguity. After tens of millions of years, essentially none of the physical objects a civilization built would survive in a form anyone could recognize. What can survive, they pointed out, is chemistry. A rapid pulse of carbon released into the atmosphere by industrial activity would leave an isotopic signature in ocean sediments, not unlike the signature we do see in true geological events like the PETM. Certain trace metals, concentrated in unusual ratios by mining and industrial processing, might also persist as a thin geochemical anomaly. Their conclusion was that if such a civilization had existed and had since vanished, The only trace we could expect to find, tens of millions of years later, would look exactly like an unusual geochemical layer. The sort of thing that gets studied, named, and filed as a natural anomaly, because there would be no way, using chemistry alone, to distinguish an industrial cause from a sufficiently unusual natural one. This is a real and legitimate scientific point about the limits of what geology can tell us, and it has been cited a number of times in later work exploring detection limits for civilizations more generally, including in the field sometimes called astrobiology, which studies the conditions under which life and intelligence might arise elsewhere. But it is important not to overstate its reach. The paper does not provide any positive evidence that an earlier civilization existed. It is a statement about the boundaries of what could, in principle, ever be ruled in or ruled out. Not a discovery of something that was ruled in. It's a bit like proving that a particular kind of very quiet whisper could not be picked up by any microphone from across a football field. That is a meaningful and interesting fact about acoustics. It tells you nothing at all about whether anyone actually whispered. So, when people connect this thought experiment to the PETM's unresolved carbon budget and suggest the combination points toward a lost civilization, it helps to keep both pieces separate in your mind. One is a real open question in climate science about how 3 known natural processes add up. The other is a real, but purely theoretical, statement about detection limits. Putting them side by side is intellectually interesting, and it is fair to notice the resemblance. But resemblance is not confirmation, and the overwhelming majority of researchers who study the PETM continue to work within the framework of natural mechanisms, refining volcanic output estimates, methane release models, and feedback effects, because that is where the actual evidence keeps pointing. There is something genuinely calming, in a strange way, about thinking through what would actually remain of our own civilization after a very long stretch of geological time. Not because it is a comfortable thought exactly, but because it turns an abstract question into something concrete and answerable. The kind of thing you can work out with ordinary physics and chemistry rather than speculation. Cities would not last long. In the grand scheme of things, without upkeep, buildings begin to fail within decades. Roofs go first, then walls, then foundations. Within a few thousand years, vegetation, weather, and slow geological movement erase almost everything visible. A modern city left alone for 1 million years becomes, essentially, an unusual patch of soil, chemically a little different from its surroundings, but with no outline, no walls. Nothing an observer would recognize as having been built by anyone. Plastic, something we tend to think of as almost eternal because it resists natural decay so well, actually breaks down within a few 100,000 years under sunlight, heat, and microbial action, which sounds long to us but is a small fraction of geological time. Steel and other metals oxidize and disperse over tens of thousands of years. Even nuclear waste, among the most durable materials we produce, has isotopes whose radioactivity fades to background levels within a few million years, though certain very long-lived isotopes can leave faint traces detectable for longer. What is left, after enough time has passed, is essentially what Schmidt and Frank described: a handful of chemical signals, unusual concentrations of certain metals in a thin band of rock, corresponding to mining and industrial activity, a shift in the isotopic ratio of atmospheric carbon, corresponding to the burning of fossil fuels, a process that has already measurably altered the chemistry of the atmosphere. and will very likely be detectable in ocean sediments for millions of years to come. In the same broad way, the PETM is detectable today. It is a sobering thought, but also a very ordinary application of geochemistry. The same kind of reasoning scientists use every day when studying rocks from earlier eras. This general question of how detectable a civilization might be across long stretches of time connects to a much older and more well-known puzzle called the Fermi paradox, named after the physicist Enrico Fermi, who reportedly asked, during a casual lunchtime conversation in the 1950s, a very simple question: given how many stars and planets exist in our galaxy, where is everybody? If intelligent life is common, we might expect to have found some evidence of it by now, whether through radio signals, probes, or other tracers. The fact that we have not is not proof that we are alone, but it has generated decades of serious scientific thinking about what factors might make intelligent civilizations rare, short-lived, or simply difficult to detect across the vast distances and timescales involved. The Schmidt and Frank paper sits comfortably within that broader tradition of careful, speculative reasoning about detectability, the kind of science that asks precise questions about what evidence could look like, without claiming to have found any. Let's shift our attention now from 56 million years ago to something much closer. A period around 12,800 years before the present, near the very end of the last ice age. This period has its own long-running scientific debate, and it is worth walking through slowly, because it shows how science handles a genuinely contested question, one where reasonable, well-credentialed researchers disagree, and where the honest answer today is still that we do not fully know. As the last ice age was ending, the climate of the northern hemisphere was warming fairly steadily, ice sheets retreating, temperatures rising. Then, abruptly, in a shift that geologists can resolve down to a matter of decades in some ice cores, temperatures in much of the northern hemisphere dropped sharply again by several degrees, and stayed cold for roughly 1,200 years before warming resumed. This cold interval is called the Younger Dryas, named after a small Arctic wildflower whose pollen appears abundantly in sediment layers from this period, marking the return of cold conditions. The traditional and still most widely accepted explanation involves fresh water, as the great ice sheet covering much of North America melted. An enormous glacial lake, larger than any lake that exists today, is thought to have drained suddenly into the North Atlantic Ocean, because fresh water is less dense than salt water. This sudden influx could have disrupted a major ocean current system, one that normally carries warm water northward and helps keep the North Atlantic region mild. Shutting down or weakening that circulation, the reasoning goes, could plausibly trigger a sharp regional cooling that would spread more broadly across the hemisphere. This meltwater explanation has been the dominant view since the 1980s and remains, supported by a great deal of oceanographic and sedimentary evidence. Since the early 2000s, a smaller group of researchers has proposed an additional or alternative explanation, sometimes called the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. Their argument centers on a layer of sediment found at a number of sites across North America and more contested at some sites elsewhere, dated to approximately this same window of time. In that layer, researchers have reported unusually high concentrations of certain materials, including microscopic diamonds called nanodiamonds, tiny magnetic spherules consistent with rapidly melted and cooled material, and elevated iridium, an element that is rare at Earth's surface but more common in certain types of extraterrestrial material. Proponents argue this combination is best explained by a cosmic impact or airburst, perhaps involving fragments of a comet, that could have contributed to or triggered the abrupt cooling, alongside widespread wildfires and disruption to the ecosystems and human populations of the time. This hypothesis remains genuinely contested within the scientific community, and it is important to represent that honestly rather than picking a side for you. A number of independent research teams have attempted to replicate the nonodium mand and spheral findings at some of the same sites and report not finding the same concentrations, or attribute what they do find to more mundane processes, like wildfire, char, or ordinary background levels of these materials. Other researchers continue to report findings that support the impact interpretation and have expanded the list of sites where they say the signature appears. Long-running scientific disagreements like this are not unusual, and they typically get resolved slowly through repeated independent testing, refinement of dating methods, and, sometimes, discovery of new physical evidence. One piece of evidence that added fuel to this debate came in 2018, when researchers using ice-penetrating radar identified a large impact crater roughly 31 kilometers across, buried beneath the Greenland ice sheet at a site called Hiawatha. When it was first announced, some early estimates floated the possibility that the impact could be roughly contemporary with the Younger Dryas onset, which understandably generated excitement among proponents of the impact hypothesis. However, more recent and more precise dating work, published by several independent groups since then, using isotopic analysis of material from the crater itself, has placed the impact at a much older age, on the order of hundreds of thousands to around 58 million years old, well outside the Younger Dryas window. This is a good illustration of how science actually self-corrects. An exciting early hypothesis generated real enthusiasm, but subsequent, more rigorous dating work moved the evidence away from that interpretation, and the field adjusted accordingly, rather than clinging to the more dramatic story. So where does that leave the overall picture? The Younger Dryas cooling event itself is real and well documented. The meltwater and ocean circulation explanation remains the leading model and continues to be refined and supported by strong physical evidence. The impact hypothesis remains a minority position within the field, actively pursued by a genuine group of researchers, but not broadly accepted as established, and the Hiawatha crater, once considered a promising piece of supporting evidence, now appears to be unrelated in time. This is simply what an unresolved, actively studied scientific question looks like, while it is still being worked out, not evidence of anything being suppressed or ignored. Contested hypotheses get published, tested, argued over at conferences, and either strengthened or weakened by new data, which is exactly the ordinary, sometimes slow, machinery of science functioning as intended around this same broad period. Something else was happening across the world. A wave of extinctions among very large land animals. The mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, and other so-called megafauna that had thrived through the Ice Age. In North America specifically, this coincides roughly with a change in the archaeological record associated with the Clovis culture. An early group of highly skilled toolmakers known for finely crafted stone spear points found across the continent. Their distinctive tool style becomes much less common in the archaeological record after this period, though it's worth being precise that this reflects a change in a particular style of tool that archaeologists use as a marker, not necessarily the sudden disappearance of the people themselves. since later cultures continued living across the same regions. The causes of the megafauna extinctions are themselves a long-standing and genuinely multifaceted area of research. And most researchers today think it likely involved more than one factor working together rather than any single cause. Human hunting pressure is one well-supported contributor, especially for species that reproduced slowly and had no evolutionary experience with human hunters. Climate change at the end of the Ice Age, including habitat shifts as forests and grasslands changed rapidly, is another well-supported contributor. Some researchers have also proposed disease, changing predator relationships, or, as we just discussed, the more contested impact and abrupt cooling hypothesis as potential compounding factors. The similar timing of large animal declines on other continents, including Eurasia and Australia, is sometimes cited as evidence for a more global, climate-driven cause, though the timing and causes on different continents do vary more than is sometimes suggested, with some declines happening earlier or later and for locally specific reasons. This remains an active and reasonably debated area of paleontology, without a single tidy answer that all researchers agree on, which is exactly the kind of nuance that tends to get flattened when this topic is simplified for a general audience. Let's move to a place that is, on its own merits, one of the most genuinely surprising archaeological sites ever found. No exaggeration required. In the hills of southeastern Turkey sits a site called Göbekli Tepe, discovered by a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt, who excavated it for many years until his death in 2014. It consists of a series of large circular enclosures, each containing multiple T-shaped limestone pillars, some standing over 5 meters tall and weighing up to 10 tons. Many decorated with carved images of animals, including foxes, boars, snakes, birds, and scorpions. What makes this site remarkable is its age. Radiocarbon dating places the oldest structures at roughly 11,500 years before the present, which is about 6,000 years older than Stonehenge, and around 7,000 years older than the earliest Egyptian pyramids. According to the conventional timeline of human development, the people who built it would have been hunter-gatherers, without settled agriculture, without large permanent towns, and without the kind of organized labor structures usually associated with monumental construction. That mismatch is exactly why Göbekli Tepe has reshaped how archaeologists think about the transition to settled life. Klaus Schmidt himself proposed a striking idea: that the need to feed and organize workers for a project like this may have been part of what drove the development of agriculture in the region, rather than agriculture coming first and monuments following afterward, as archaeologists had long assumed. This does not require anything beyond ordinary human ingenuity, but it does suggest that our picture of Neolithic hunter-gatherer societies has been too simple, that they were capable of large-scale cooperative projects, sustained over years, well before farming took hold. Excavations at the site have found evidence of large-scale food preparation, including remains suggesting big feasts, which supports the idea that people gathered from a wide area periodically to work on and celebrate around the site. There has also been genuine scholarly interest in the carvings themselves, particularly one heavily decorated pillar sometimes called the vulture stone, which shows a collection of animal figures in specific arrangements. One research team from the University of Edinburgh proposed in a published paper that some of these figures might represent constellations, and used astronomical software to suggest the arrangement could correspond to the position of stars at a particular date. This is an interesting and creative hypothesis, but it's worth being clear that it remains a minority interpretation, contested by many archaeologists who work on the site, who point out that reading specific star constellations and calendar dates into carvings that are otherwise open to many, and that simpler explanations tied to hunting, ritual, or symbolic meaning specific to that culture, are also well supported by the broader context of similar carvings found at nearby sites from the same era. Most archaeologists studying Göbekli Tepe today treat the astronomical interpretation as one interesting proposal among several, not as a settled finding. What is well established and remarkable enough on its own is this: the enclosures at Göbekli Tepe were deliberately buried under layers of soil and rubble at various points, rather than simply left to decay or fall into ruin. Archaeologists have proposed a range of explanations for this, including ritual closure of a site once its purpose had been fulfilled, a practice attested in other ancient contexts, or a practical need to build newer structures over older ones as the site was used across many generations. The deliberate burial is, incidentally, part of why the site survived in such remarkable condition, protecting the carvings and structure from millennia of weathering that would otherwise have worn them down. Whatever the reason for the burial, the site stands as clear, physical proof that organized, symbolically rich, monumental construction is older and was within reach of societies simpler in structure than researchers assumed only a few decades ago. That alone was enough to meaningfully revise the standard account of how civilization began, without needing to reach for anything beyond the genuinely surprising capabilities of the hunter-gatherers who lived. There is another real and well-documented process from this same broad window of time that connects, quite naturally, to something found in cultures all over the world, and that is the rise of sea level as the last ice age ended, between roughly 15,000 and 7,000 years before the present. As the great continental ice sheets melted, global sea level rose by approximately 120 meters. This did not happen at a perfectly steady pace. Sediment and coral core records show that the rise came in pulses, including at least one especially rapid pulse around 14,000 years ago, during which sea level may have risen roughly 20 meters over just a few centuries, an event sometimes referred to by researchers as Meltwater Pulse 1A. It's worth sitting with what that actually meant for people living through it. A family living on a coastline during this period would have seen the shoreline shift, sometimes gradually, sometimes suddenly, over the course of a single lifetime, and the changes would have compounded across many generations. Coastal plains, river deltas, and lowland areas that had supported communities for a very long time were gradually submerged, because low-lying coastal areas tend to be the most attractive places for early human settlement, rich in fish, shellfish, and fertile land. It stands to reason that many early coastal sites from this period are now underwater, sitting on what oceanographers call the continental shelf, the shallow, gently sloping seabed that surrounds most continents. This is an active and genuinely underexplored area of archaeology. A small number of submerged sites have been identified and studied, including structures off the coast of Japan near Yonaguni, whose origin, whether natural rock formation shaped by erosion or a human-made structure, remains disputed among researchers, and a site in the Gulf of Cambay, off the coast of India, where some researchers reported evidence of a submerged settlement, though this claim has also faced significant scientific criticism regarding dating methods and the nature of the recovered materials, and has not achieved broad acceptance. Underwater archaeology of this kind is difficult, expensive, and still in fairly early stages compared to land-based archaeology. So it remains entirely possible, and even likely, that some early coastal history is still waiting to be properly surveyed and understood. This is a case where genuine scientific uncertainty and genuine potential for future discovery exist side by side, without needing to invoke anything beyond ordinary human history and hard-to-reach underwater terrain. This same period of dramatic coastal flooding offers a fairly compelling explanation for something anthropologists have long found interesting: the remarkable prevalence of flood narratives across cultures with no historical contact with one another. From Mesopotamian traditions to accounts found among indigenous peoples of the Americas, Australia, and elsewhere. Researchers who study comparative mythology point out that oral traditions, especially in societies without writing, are capable of preserving the memory of significant environmental events across many generations, gradually compressed and reshaped through retelling into more symbolic or singular narrative forms. A slow, multi-generational experience of the sea reclaiming ancestral land, punctuated by faster pulses that would have felt sudden and dramatic to the people experiencing them, is a very plausible seed for stories about a great flood that ended a previous world. It's a reasonable and reasonably well-supported idea within comparative mythology and folklore studies, though it remains, appropriately, an interpretation rather than a proven mechanism. Since we cannot directly trace any single myth back to a specific flooding event with certainty, some flood traditions are also tied to more regional and independently documented events, such as the catastrophic flooding of the Black Sea basin from the Mediterranean roughly 7,500 years ago, an event some researchers have proposed as a plausible seed for certain Near Eastern flood traditions. Specifically, one of the better documented examples of a drowned coastal landscape sits much closer to home for many listeners, beneath what is now the southern North Sea, in an area archaeologists call Doggerland. During the Ice Age, and for some time afterward, this was dry, low-lying land connecting Britain to the rest of continental Europe, crossed by rivers, dotted with lakes, and populated by Mesolithic hunter-gatherer communities. As sea levels rose through the same broad window we've been discussing, this land was flooded in stages, with a final, more abrupt loss of the remaining higher ground associated with rising seas around 8,000 years ago, compounded in some models by a large submarine landslide off the coast of Norway called the Storegga Slide, which likely generated a significant tsunami that would have struck the remaining low-lying coastal areas of Doggerland and nearby regions, unlike some of the more speculative underwater sites we discussed earlier. Doggerland's submerged Mesolithic history is unusually well supported by physical evidence. Fishing trawlers working the North Sea have, over many decades, pulled up thousands of animal bones, antler tools, and worked flint artifacts from the seabed. And sediment cores have allowed researchers to reconstruct former river channels, lake beds, and forest floors now sitting many meters underwater. Recent research programs have used seismic survey data, originally collected for oil and gas exploration, to map the ancient topography of this drowned landscape in impressive detail, effectively producing a map of a vanished country. This gives us about as clear a picture as currently exists anywhere of what it actually looked like for a community to lose its homeland gradually to the sea, over generations, exactly the kind of lived experience that likely fed into the broader human tradition of flood stories discussed earlier. Grounded this time in a specific, well-mapped, and thoroughly evidenced example rather than a more speculative one. It might help, at this point, to step back and talk about how scientists actually assign dates to events this old in the first place, since so much of what we've covered depends on that kind of precision. The most familiar method is radiocarbon dating, which measures the decay of a radioactive isotope of carbon that forms in the atmosphere and is taken up by living organisms at a roughly known rate. Because this particular isotope decays with a half-life of about 5,700 years, meaning half of it disappears every 5,700 years. Radiocarbon dating works well for organic material up to about 50,000 years old, which is why it's the primary tool used for dating things like the wood, bone, and charcoal found at sites such as Göbekli Tepe for much older material. Like the rock layers containing the PETM, scientists rely on different tools. One is the steady decay of other radioactive isotopes found in volcanic ash layers, which have much longer half-lives and can date rock reliably across tens or hundreds of millions of years. Another is orbital tuning, which compares subtle, repeating patterns in sediment layers caused by cyclical changes in Earth's orbit and axial tilt against precisely calculated astronomical cycles, allowing geologists to count backward through geological time almost the way you might count growth rings in a tree. Those orbital cycles are worth understanding a little further, because they explain something important about why Earth's climate has natural rhythms in the first place. A Serbian scientist named Milutin Milankovic worked out, in the early 20th century, that slow, predictable variations in three aspects of Earth's orbit and rotation, the shape of its orbit around the Sun, the tilt of its axis, and the way the axis slowly wobbles over time, combine to change how much sunlight reaches different latitudes at different times of year, on cycles lasting tens of thousands to around 100,000 years. These Milankovitch cycles, as they're now called, are widely credited with pacing the rhythm of ice ages and warmer, interglacial periods over roughly the last 2.5 million years, and their fingerprints are clearly visible in ice cores and ocean sediment records going back much further still. We are currently living in a warm interglacial period, a state that, based on the orbital cycle alone, would be expected to eventually give way to renewed glacial conditions many thousands of years from now, on its own natural timescale, entirely separate from anything to do with human activity. The PE, as dramatic as it was not actually a unique, one-time event in Earth's deep past. Researchers have identified a whole series of smaller, related rapid warming episodes in the tens of millions of years that followed it, with names like ETM2 and ETM3, standing for Eocene Thermal Maximum 2 and 3, each showing a similar pattern of rapid carbon release and warming. Though generally smaller in scale than the original PETM, their existence is actually reassuring in a scientific sense, because it shows that the Earth system is capable of producing this general type of rapid carbon release event repeatedly, through ordinary geological processes, whenever the right combination of volcanic activity, methane release, and feedback loops line up, rather than requiring a single, one-off, hard to explain cause each time. It's a pattern rather than an anomaly, and patterns are exactly what natural, physical explanations tend to produce. We also have a remarkably precise record of atmospheric carbon dioxide reaching back much closer to the present, thanks to ice cores drilled in Antarctica and Greenland. As snow falls and compacts into ice over thousands of years, it traps tiny bubbles of the atmosphere from the time it fell, effectively preserving a continuous archive of the ancient atmosphere layer by layer. The longest of these cores, drilled at a site in Antarctica called Dome Sea, extends back roughly 800,000 years and shows carbon dioxide levels cycling between around 180 and 280 parts per million. Tracking closely with the glacial and interglacial cycles, driven by the Milankovitch orbital rhythms we just discussed. Today, largely as a result of burning fossil fuels since the industrial era began, atmospheric carbon dioxide sits above 420 parts per million, meaningfully higher than anything recorded across that entire 800,000-year ice core record, and the rate at which it has risen over the past century is faster than any rate of change visible anywhere in that record as well. The isotopic signature of this modern carbon dioxide increase does carry the biological fingerprint we discussed earlier, consistent with its origin in ancient organic material, coal, oil, and natural gas, that formed from living organisms tens to hundreds of millions of years ago and has now been burned and released back into the atmosphere over a remarkably short span of time. This is where the deep past and the present start to genuinely inform each other, in a way climate scientists take quite seriously, without needing any dramatic framing to make the point land. The PETM is one of the closest natural analogues we have for understanding what a large, relatively rapid injection of biologically sourced carbon can do to global climate and ocean chemistry, precisely because it involved the same broad mechanism. Carbon that once passed through living organisms being released back into the atmosphere, much faster than the natural carbon cycle typically operates. Researchers who study the PETM often describe it explicitly as a natural laboratory for understanding possible long-term consequences of the current rise in carbon dioxide, including questions about how long elevated temperatures might persist, how ocean chemistry might respond, including a process called ocean acidification, and how ecosystems might be affected by a warming and chemically shifting ocean. It's worth being careful and precise about scale here, since it's easy to either overstate or understate the comparison. The total amount of carbon released during the PETM was substantially larger than the total amount humans are expected to release even under high emission scenarios, and it occurred over a few thousand years, whereas the modern increase has occurred over roughly 2 centuries. An even faster rate in the moment, though a smaller total volume so far. The resulting temperature rise during the PETM, 5 to 8 degrees Celsius, is considerably larger than the 1.2 degrees Celsius of warming observed since pre-industrial times today, though it sits within, or exceeds, the range of projected warming, under some higher emission scenarios modeled. For the coming century, what genuinely worries researchers who study these deep time analogues is less about matching the PETM's exact numbers and more about the general behavior of feedback loops, processes that, once triggered, continue to release additional carbon or amplify warming somewhat independently of the original human-caused input. Thawing permafrost, which contains large stores of organic carbon that can be released as carbon dioxide and methane as it warms, is one actively studied example. Changes in ocean circulation and the potential for reduced carbon uptake by warming oceans is another. Understanding exactly where thresholds for these feedbacks lie, and how reversible or irreversible they might be once triggered, remains a genuinely active and uncertain area of climate science. And it's an area where the deep geological record, including the PETM and the smaller hypothermal events that followed it, continues to provide useful, real-world data points for testing and refining climate models, rather than serving as a message meant for us specifically. It is, more simply, the best natural experiment of this general kind that the Earth happens to have already run, and scientists are making good, careful use of it. Let's go back briefly to the deep ocean floor, because the way scientists actually detect and study something like the PETM is itself a quietly fascinating piece of science. Much of the evidence comes from tiny, single-celled marine organisms called foraminophora, sometimes just called forams, which build microscopic shells out of calcium carbonate drawn from the surrounding seawater. As they build these shells, they incorporate oxygen and carbon isotopes from the water in ratios that reflect the temperature and chemistry of the ocean at that exact place and time. When these organisms die, their shells settle to the ocean floor and accumulate, layer upon layer, over millions of years, forming a continuous, extraordinarily detailed archive. By drilling cylindrical cores down through these layered seafloor sediments, sometimes through several hundred meters of accumulated material, and then measuring the isotopic ratios in the fossilized shells at each depth, researchers can reconstruct ocean temperature and carbon chemistry with remarkable resolution, sometimes down to individual centuries, even across tens of millions of years. This work is largely made possible by a long-running international research effort, going back to the 1960s and continuing today under a program now called the International Ocean Discovery Program, which coordinates scientific drilling expeditions around the world specifically to recover these deep sediment archives for climate research at the PETM boundary itself. These cores show something quite dramatic happening to the shells, because the added carbon dioxide made the ocean more acidic, a process called ocean acidification. Calcium carbonate shells became harder for many organisms to build and maintain, and in many core samples, researchers find a visibly thinner or even partially dissolved layer of shells right at the boundary. Direct physical evidence of the chemical stress the ocean was under during the event. A significant proportion of deep-sea foraminiferous species, some of which had persisted largely unchanged for tens of millions of years before this event, disappear from the record at this same boundary, marking one of the more significant extinctions among deep-sea organisms in the last 100 million years. The planet's eventual recovery from the PETM, over that roughly 200,000 year span mentioned earlier, involved a genuinely elegant natural process called the silicate weathering feedback, sometimes called Earth's long-term thermostat. Higher atmospheric carbon dioxide and warmer temperatures increase rainfall and accelerate the chemical weathering of silicate rocks on land, a process that consumes atmospheric carbon dioxide and eventually carries it, dissolved in rivers, to the ocean, where it is locked away in carbonate sediments. This feedback operates slowly, typically over tens to hundreds of thousands of years, which is part of why the PETM's excess carbon took roughly 200,000 years to fully draw down, even though it had been released in a small fraction of that time. This same feedback mechanism is one of the reasons climate scientists are confident that Earth's climate will eventually stabilize after the current period of human-caused carbon emissions as well, though on a timescale that operates far too slowly to be of practical comfort on human timescales, since it would still take many tens of thousands of years to fully draw down the excess. Let's return, more gently this time, to that broader question we touched on earlier, about detecting civilizations across vast stretches of time or distance, because it connects to a wider field of study that's worth understanding on its own terms. In 1961, an astronomer named Frank Drake proposed what's now called the Drake equation, a way of organizing our uncertainty about how many communicating civilizations might exist in our galaxy at any given time. It multiplies together a series of factors: the rate of star formation, the fraction of stars with planets, the fraction of those planets that could support life, the fraction where life actually arises, the fraction where that life becomes intelligent, the fraction that develops technology capable of sending detectable signals, and finally, the average length of time such a civilization continues broadcasting those signals before falling silent. For whatever reason, most of these factors remain genuinely uncertain, though our knowledge of some of them has improved enormously since 1961. The discovery of thousands of planets orbiting other stars, largely thanks to space telescopes like Kepler and, more recently, the James Webb Space Telescope, has given us real, data-driven estimates for how common planets are, suggesting that most stars likely host at least one planet, and that planets in the right temperature range to potentially support liquid water are not especially rare either. The much harder factors to estimate remain how often life actually arises on a habitable planet, how often it becomes complex and intelligent, and, crucially for our purposes tonight, how long a technological civilization typically persists. That last factor, sometimes called the longevity term, is where our own detectability across geological time becomes scientifically relevant. And it's part of why the Schmidt and Frank paper we discussed earlier has been cited by researchers working on these broader questions. If technological civilizations tend to be short-lived on cosmic or even geological timescales, whether due to self-inflicted environmental pressures, resource depletion, or simply how difficult it is to sustain complex technological society over very long periods, then even a galaxy that has produced many such civilizations across its history might show very few, or none, existing at the same moment we happen to be looking. This idea is sometimes called the temporal dispersion problem, the notion that civilizations might be relatively common across the full history of the galaxy, but rare at any single snapshot in time, simply because each one's window of detectability, however defined, is short compared to the age of the galaxy as a whole. None of this tells us anything definite about whether other civilizations exist, have existed, or will exist. What it does provide is a genuinely useful, humble framework for thinking about our own situation, including the very real, very current question of how our own choices might affect how long and in what form our civilization persists, and what kind of trace, if any, it eventually leaves behind, whether in the form of ongoing habitation of this planet, expansion elsewhere, or, in the least fortunate case, nothing more than an unusual layer of chemistry in the rock, quietly waiting for something else to find it a very long time from now. Since Klaus Schmidt's original excavations, our picture of this region and period has continued to expand in genuinely exciting ways. Not far from Göbekli Tepe, another site called Karahan Tepe, first surveyed decades ago but only extensively excavated much more recently, has revealed its own set of carved pillars and enclosures, including a room containing a row of carved human-like heads emerging from a bench, along with a large carved figure that some researchers interpret as a phallic or fertility symbol, dated to a broadly similar period. Karahan Tepe is part of a wider regional research effort, sometimes called the Tas Tepe Project, meaning Stone Hills, which has identified numerous related sites scattered across the same area of southeastern Turkey, suggesting Göbekli Tepe was not an isolated achievement but part of a broader regional culture capable of this kind of monumental construction across multiple communities. This regional picture connects directly to one of the most significant developments in human history, the origin of agriculture. Genetic studies of modern domesticated wheat varieties, particularly a type called einkorn wheat, have traced their wild ancestor to a specific mountain range in this same general region of southeastern Turkey, remarkably close to Göbekli Tepe itself, suggesting this area was one of the actual locations where humans first began deliberately cultivating and eventually domesticating cereal crops. Sometime in the following centuries after these monumental sites were built, this lends real support to Klaus Schmidt's proposal that organizing labor and food for large communal gatherings and construction projects may have created pressure that helped drive the shift toward deliberate cultivation. Since feeding large groups gathered periodically for these projects would have been logistically demanding using hunting and foraging alone, it's a case where genuinely careful archaeology, geography, and genetics all converge on the same region and the same rough time period, offering a coherent, evidence-based account of one of the most important transitions in human history, without needing anything beyond the ordinary. Remarkable ingenuity of the people who lived there. Let's return once more to the question of oral tradition and long-term memory, because there is a particularly well-documented body of research on this from Australia that deserves a slower look. Researchers working with Aboriginal Australian communities have collected and studied a number of traditional stories, describing coastlines that once extended much further out to sea than they do today, in specific locations all around the Australian continent. When geologists compared the described locations against reconstructed ancient shorelines, based on sea level and bathymetric data, in a number of cases, the described features matched coastal geography that would have existed during the same broad period of post-Ice Age sea level rise we discussed earlier. In some cases, matching shorelines from 7,000 years ago or more. This research, conducted collaboratively between geologists and Aboriginal community knowledge holders and published in peer-reviewed journals over the past decade, has been taken as reasonably serious evidence that some oral traditions can indeed preserve accurate information about specific real-world events and geography across spans of many thousands of years and dozens of generations, far longer than had generally been assumed possible for purely oral transmission. Given how much cultural stories typically drift and change over time, this doesn't mean every traditional story with flood imagery corresponds to a specific datable event, and researchers involved in this work are careful to note that verifying such correspondences requires independent geological or archaeological evidence for each specific case, rather than assuming it as a general rule. But it does provide a genuinely well-supported, evidence-based example of the kind of long-term memory preservation that likely explains, in general terms, why flood-related narratives appear so widely across cultures whose ancestors lived through the same broad multi-thousand-year period of dramatic global coastal change. It's worth spending a moment on how the PETM was actually discovered in the first place, since it wasn't obvious from the start that such an event had even happened. In the late 1980s and into the early 1990s, researchers examining deep-sea sediment cores including work led by the paleoceanographers James Kennett and Lowell Stott, noticed an unusual and abrupt shift in oxygen and carbon isotope ratios in foraminifer shells at a specific, narrow layer, corresponding to the boundary between two geological epochs called the Paleocene and the Eocene. What caught their attention was how sharp the transition was compared to the normally gradual shifts seen throughout the rest of the sediment record, along with the widespread extinction of deep-sea foraminifera species occurring at exactly that same layer. Their 1991 paper describing this event is generally considered the founding study of PETM research, and the event has been the subject of steadily expanding research ever since, as cores from more and more locations around the world confirmed that the same sharp signal appeared globally, which is exactly what you'd expect from a genuinely global event affecting the whole atmosphere and ocean system, rather than a local or regional phenomenon. As for what actually triggered the initial pulse of volcanic activity, often cited as a major contributor, that traces back to a period of intense geological activity called the North Atlantic Igneous Province, associated with the early stages of continental separation between Greenland and northern Europe, as the supercontinent arrangement of that era continued the slow process of breaking apart that had been ongoing for tens of millions of years already, part of the broader, well-understood process of plate tectonics, in which Earth's outer shell is divided into large plates that drift slowly across the planet's surface over geological time, driven by heat moving within the deeper mantle beneath them. As magma associated with this rifting intruded into surrounding carbon-rich sedimentary rock, it would have baked and released large quantities of trapped carbon dioxide and methane, structures preserved in this region today. Structures which have been extensively surveyed using seismic imaging techniques similar to those used to study oil and gas reservoirs. Let's spend a little more time on methane hydrates, sometimes called clathrates, since they're a genuinely interesting and slightly strange form of matter in their own right. A methane hydrate is a kind of ice-like solid in which methane molecules become trapped inside a cage of water molecules, forming a stable structure only under specific conditions of high pressure and low temperature, conditions commonly found in sediments along the outer edges of continental shelves, at ocean depths where pressure is high and temperatures stay cold year-round. Enormous quantities of methane are believed to be locked away in these deposits worldwide, formed over long periods from the slow decomposition of organic material by microorganisms living in these sediments, which is why any methane released from them carries that same biological isotopic signature we discussed earlier, because these deposits are stable only within a fairly narrow range of temperature and pressure. Even a modest amount of ocean warming can shift enough of the seafloor into a temperature range where the hydrates become unstable and begin releasing their trapped methane into the surrounding water and eventually the atmosphere. Once released and oxidized in the atmosphere, methane converts fairly quickly into carbon dioxide, contributing to the same kind of biologically sourced carbon signal found in the PETM sediment layers. This creates the potential for a feedback loop, since releasing this methane contributes to further warming, which could destabilize additional hydrate deposits in turn. A scenario researchers sometimes refer to, only partly in jest, as the clathrate gun hypothesis, a term coined in the 1990s by the researcher James Kennett, the same scientist involved in the original discovery of the PETM boundary layer. It's worth noting that this hypothesis, in its most dramatic form, suggesting a single, sudden, catastrophic release capable of driving rapid climate shifts on its own, has faced considerable scientific scrutiny and skepticism over the years, and most current research treats hydrate destabilization as one genuine contributing factor among several rather than a single sufficient explanation on its own. Whether for the PETM specifically, or for other rapid climate shifts in the geological record, current research on modern Arctic and subsea permafrost, including ongoing survey work in areas like the Siberian Shelf, continues to monitor methane release from thawing, hydrate and permafrost deposits today, precisely because understanding how quickly and how much these deposits might destabilize under continued modern warming remains one of the more important open uncertainties in current climate projections. It's worth taking a small detour into the history of how we came to understand that ice ages happened at all, since it wasn't always obvious. And the story says something interesting about how scientific understanding of deep time develops gradually, through careful observation rather than sudden revelation. In the early 1800s, naturalists traveling through the Alps had noticed strange features scattered across the landscape. Large boulders sitting in places that seemed to have no relation to the local rock. Deep parallel scratches carved into exposed bedrock. And oddly shaped ridges of gravel and rubble running through valleys far from any current glacier. A Swiss naturalist named Louis Agassiz proposed, in the 1830s, that these features could be explained if glaciers had once extended much further than they do today, covering large parts of Europe in a great ice sheet that had since retreated, leaving these physical traces behind as it melted. This idea faced considerable resistance at first, since it required accepting that the climate of an entire continent had once been radically different from anything within human historical memory. But the physical evidence, careful mapping of glacial scratches, transported boulders, and characteristic ridge formations across the landscape eventually became overwhelming, and the concept of past ice ages became a foundational part of geology. This connects to the radiometric dating methods we touched on earlier, since figuring out exactly how many ice ages there have been, and precisely when they occurred, required increasingly precise dating tools developed over the following century and a half. Beyond the radiocarbon method used for more recent organic material, geologists rely heavily on methods like potassium-argon dating and its more refined version, argon-argon dating, which measure the decay of a radioactive form of potassium into argon gas within volcanic rock, a process with a half-life of over 1 billion years, making it well suited to dating rocks that are millions to billions of years old, including the volcanic ash layers that help pin down precise dates for events like the PETM uranium-lead dating, which tracks the decay of uranium into lead within certain crystals. Particularly, a mineral called zircon provides similarly precise dating for even older rock, in some cases going back to the very earliest history of the Earth itself, over 4 billion years ago. Each of these methods has been independently cross-checked against the others many times over, at sites where more than one dating technique can be applied to the same rock layer, and they consistently agree with one another within their respective margins of error, which is part of why geologists have such a high degree of confidence in the overall timeline of Earth's history that these methods, together, have allowed us to construct. Since we've spent some time on the more contested Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, it's worth pausing to describe what a confirmed, well-established impact event actually looks like in the geological record. Since the contrast is genuinely instructive, 66 million years ago, an asteroid or comet, estimated at around 10 to 15 kilometers across, struck what is now the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, leaving behind a crater called Chicxulub, roughly 180 kilometers in diameter, one of the largest confirmed impact structures on Earth. This event marks the boundary between the Cretaceous and Paleogene periods, sometimes called the KPG boundary, and is now solidly established as the primary cause of the mass extinction that ended the age of non-avian dinosaurs. Along with roughly 75% of all species on the planet at the time, the evidence supporting this is genuinely overwhelming and multiply confirmed, which is worth understanding as a point of comparison. A thin layer of clay found at the KPG boundary at sites all over the world contains a sharp spike in iridium concentration, at levels far too high to be explained by normal terrestrial processes but consistent with the composition of certain asteroids. First identified in the late 1970s by the physicist Luis Alvarez and his son, the geologist Walter Alvarez, that same boundary layer also contains shocked quartz grains, tiny glass spherules formed from instantly melted and resolidified rock, and soot consistent with widespread wildfires, all distributed globally at the exact same geological horizon. The crater itself, buried under 0.5 kilometer of later sediment and partly beneath the Gulf of Mexico, was identified in the late 1970s through oil exploration, surveys, and confirmed through drilling. Projects that recovered rock samples showing the specific kind of shock, deformation, and melted material produced only by a very high energy impact. What makes this such a useful point of comparison is that every one of these lines of evidence, the iridium spike, the shocked quartz, the melt spherules, the global soot layer, and the crater itself, all agree with each other in both location and precise timing, replicated independently by dozens of research teams at hundreds of sites over more than 4 decades. This is what scientific consensus around an impact event actually looks like once the evidence has been thoroughly tested and cross-confirmed. It stands in useful contrast to the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, where the underlying evidence, the nanodemands and has been reported by some teams and not reliably replicated by others, and where no crater of the right age and scale has yet been confirmed. That difference in the degree and consistency of independent replication is really the central reason one hypothesis is considered settled science and the other remains a genuinely open, actively debated question. And it's a good illustration of the kind of standard that has to be met before a dramatic claim about the deep past earns broad scientific acceptance. Bringing our attention back to the present day for a moment, one of the more active areas of current climate research involves identifying and understanding what scientists call tipping points, thresholds beyond which a part of the climate system shifts into a new, self-sustaining state that would be difficult or impossible to reverse on human timescales, even if the original cause of the change were removed. This idea connects directly to the feedback loops we discussed earlier in the context of the PETM, since both involve situations where an initial change triggers further changes that continue somewhat independently of the original trigger. Researchers have proposed a number of specific tipping elements that may exist within the modern climate system, each studied through a combination of physical modeling, observation, and comparison with past climate events, including the loss of large ice sheets in Greenland and West Antarctica, shifts in ocean circulation patterns similar to the one implicated in the Younger Dryas cooling, dieback of certain large forest ecosystems under sustained drought and heat stress, and large-scale thawing of permafrost, releasing the stored carbon we discussed earlier, estimating precisely where the thresholds for these tipping points lie, and how quickly changes might unfold once a threshold is crossed, remains an area of significant scientific uncertainty, reflected honestly in reports published by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a body that periodically synthesizes the state of climate research from thousands of scientists worldwide into comprehensive assessment reports, each one carefully noting confidence levels and remaining uncertainties alongside its more established findings. This is precisely the kind of area where deep time analogues like the PETM continue to earn their keep scientifically, since they represent real, physical instances of a warming and carbon-releasing Earth system that has already played out, providing genuine data against which climate models can be tested and calibrated, rather than relying purely on theoretical projections. Ongoing research projects continue to refine our understanding of the PETM specifically, including newer drilling expeditions aimed at recovering higher resolution sediment cores from previously unsampled ocean basins, improved modeling of the relative contributions of volcanism, methane release, and feedback effects to the total carbon budget, and detailed studies of how specific ecosystems, from deep-sea organisms to land plants and early mammals, responded to and eventually recovered from the associated warming and ocean chemistry changes. Each new core and each refined model brings the field slightly closer to resolving that long-standing question about exactly how the PETM's carbon budget adds up. The same open question we began with tonight, patiently, the way most genuine scientific questions eventually get resolved, through the slow accumulation of better data rather than any single decisive breakthrough. There's a way of thinking about all of this that geologists sometimes use to make deep time feel a little more graspable, and it might be worth sitting with quietly for a moment. Imagine compressing the entire 4.5 billion year history of the Earth into a single calendar year, starting at midnight on January 1st and ending at midnight on December 31st. On this scale, the Earth itself forms sometime in the very first minutes of January. The earliest simple life appears sometime in February or March. Complex, multicellular life doesn't really get going until sometime in mid-November. The dinosaurs appear in mid-December and are wiped out by the Chicxulub impact around December 26th. The PETM, that 56 million year old carbon spike we spent so much time on tonight, would fall on about December 27th, just a day after the dinosaurs disappear. On this compressed calendar, modern humans, on this same scale, appear only in the last 20 minutes or so before midnight on December 31st. Everything covered in written history, every civilization, every war, every scientific discovery fits into the final few seconds before midnight. Göbekli Tepe, at around 11,500 years old, would have been built somewhere in the final 2 or 3 seconds of the entire year. This exercise isn't meant to feel small or insignificant. It's really more of an invitation to notice just how compressed and recent our own presence is, relative to the extraordinary length of time the planet itself has already existed, and how much has already happened and been recorded in rock and ice and sediment, long before we arrived to start reading it. It also helps explain why questions like the ones we've spent tonight exploring, what a rapid carbon release from 56 million years ago actually means, whether a particular unusual layer in the rock reflects one cause or several, how long a civilization's physical trace might last, are worth taking seriously and answering carefully rather than quickly, since the record we're trying to read is quite literally the deepest and most patient archive that exists anywhere we know of, coming back to the more recent past. The archaeological work around Göbekli Tepe and its sister sites is still very much ongoing, and it's genuinely one of the more active areas of current excavation anywhere in the world. Only a relatively small fraction of the main site at Göbekli Tepe has actually been excavated so far, with ground-penetrating radar and geophysical surveys suggesting a considerable number of additional enclosures likely remain buried and unexplored beneath the surrounding hillside. Excavation work at Karahan Tepe and other sites identified through the broader Taz-Tepler Regional Survey is continuing as well, with new findings reported fairly regularly as teams slowly and carefully work through each site, a process that in careful archaeology tends to unfold over decades rather than years, given the need to document, preserve, and study each layer thoroughly before moving to the next. Similarly, the underwater mapping of Doggerland, the drowned landscape beneath the North Sea we discussed earlier, continues through ongoing research collaborations between universities and oceanographic institutes, using increasingly detailed seismic survey data, along with sediment coring expeditions aimed at recovering preserved plant and animal remains that can help reconstruct the ancient environment, and even, in some ongoing projects, attempts to recover ancient environmental DNA directly from seafloor sediment cores, a technique that allows researchers to detect traces of ancient plants and animals that once lived in a location even without finding physical bones or artifacts. Some research teams have expressed hope that continued survey work might eventually locate submerged archaeological sites directly, actual settlement remains rather than isolated artifacts recovered by fishing trawlers. Though this kind of underwater archaeological search remains logistically difficult and resource-intensive, and any specific claimed discovery would need the same kind of careful, independently replicated verification we discussed earlier regarding other submerged sites, before being accepted as a confirmed settlement, one of the more unexpectedly delightful discoveries to come out of PETM research involves what happened to mammals during this period of rapid warming, and it's worth slowing down for, since it connects an abstract climate event to something very concrete and almost charming. Researchers studying fossil mammal remains from immediately before, during, and after the PETM noticed something curious. Several species appear to have gotten noticeably smaller in body size during the peak warming, before returning to something closer to their original size afterward, once temperatures cooled again. This pattern, sometimes called the PETM dwarfism effect, has been documented in early horses, in particular a tiny early relative of modern horses called Cyphripus, whose body size is estimated to have shrunk by roughly 30% during the warmest part of the event, before rebounding as temperatures declined over the following tens of thousands of years. And similar size reductions have been reported in some early mammal lineages more broadly across this period. The leading explanation for this pattern relates to a general biological principle sometimes summarized as Bergmann's rule: the tendency for animals in warmer climates to be smaller bodied than closely related animals in cooler climates, likely because a smaller body has a higher surface area relative to its volume, which helps with shedding excess body heat, along with the possibility that warmer temperatures may have affected plant growth and nutritional quality in ways that made supporting a larger body size more difficult during the peak of the event. This gives researchers a wonderfully concrete, physical measurement actual fossilized tooth and bone size that tracks the PETM's temperature curve almost like a biological thermometer, complementing the isotopic and chemical evidence found in ocean sediments. More broadly, the PETM coincides with a fascinating burst of evolutionary activity among early mammals. It falls right around the time that several major modern mammal groups, including the ancestors of modern primates, along with early relatives of hoofed mammals like horses and early forms of what would eventually become whales, first appear clearly in the fossil record, having likely diversified rapidly in the aftermath of the mass extinction of the dinosaurs some 10 million years earlier, then spreading and adapting further as the warm, chemically shifting world of the PETM created new ecological opportunities and challenges. Some of the very earliest primate fossils, small tree-dwelling animals not unlike some modern lemurs in general body plan, appear in the fossil record from sediment layers closely associated with this warm period, making the PETM, in a very real evolutionary sense, part of the deep ancestral backdrop against which our own distant primate lineage first began to take its recognizable shape, long before anything resembling a human walked the earth. Since we mentioned Stonehenge and the Egyptian pyramids earlier, purely as reference points for how old Göbekli Tepe actually is, it's worth spending a little time on what we actually know about how those more famous monuments were built, since the real engineering story is interesting enough without needing any embellishment. Stonehenge, in southern England, was built in several stages beginning around 5,000 years ago, with its most recognizable large stone circle likely completed a few centuries later. The smaller of its two main stone types, called bluestones, weighing up to a few tons each, have been geologically traced to a specific set of quarries in the Preseli Hills of Wales, roughly 250 kilometers away, a transport achievement that researchers have since replicated experimentally using a combination of wooden sledges, rollers, and ropes, along with the likely use of river and coastal transport for at least part of the journey, demonstrating that Neolithic-era technology, while simple by modern standards, was entirely capable of this kind of large-scale logistical achievement, given sufficient organized labor and time. The Great Pyramid of Giza, completed around 4,500 years ago during the reign of the pharaoh Khufu, involved the placement of roughly 2 million limestone and granite blocks, some weighing several tons, with the heaviest granite blocks used in its internal chambers weighing considerably more. Archaeological evidence recovered over the past few decades, including a workers' village discovered nearby containing bakeries, breweries, and medical facilities, along with administrative records found more recently in the form of papyrus logbooks kept by a work crew overseer, has given researchers a fairly detailed picture of how this labor force was organized, fed, and managed, involving a rotating, well-provisioned workforce of skilled laborers rather than, as older popular imagination sometimes suggested, enslaved captives. Engineers studying the construction have proposed and tested various methods for moving and raising the blocks, including ramps, levers, and sledges pulled over wetted sand to reduce friction, a technique actually depicted in surviving ancient Egyptian artwork showing workers pouring water in front of a sledge, and independently confirmed through physics experiments measuring how wetting sand can significantly reduce the force needed to pull a heavy sledge across it. The broader point, tying back to Göbekli Tepe, is that each of these monuments, however impressive, reflects an achievable combination of organized human labor, practical engineering knowledge developed and refined over generations, and enough time, sometimes decades, for a project to be completed. Göbekli Tepe simply demonstrates that this same basic combination, organized labor and accumulated practical knowledge, was achievable thousands of years earlier than researchers had previously assumed was possible, by societies that have not yet adopted agriculture. It's a genuinely significant revision to our understanding of early human capability, and one that required no explanation beyond expanding our estimate of what hunter-gatherer societies were capable of, once given a strong enough shared motivation to organize around its worth. Briefly returning to the Schmidt and Frank paper we discussed earlier, the one exploring whether a hypothetical earlier industrial civilization would be detectable in the geological record, because its actual academic reception is a useful, calming corrective to a certain kind of story that sometimes gets told about it online, rather than being ignored. The paper has been cited by a fairly steady stream of later academic work in the years since its publication, including papers in astrobiology discussing detection limits for technological civilizations more broadly, papers in the philosophy of science discussing the limits of what geological evidence can tell us, and continued general audience science writing exploring its implications. Gavin Schmidt himself, incidentally, has had a long and active career at NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies, primarily focused on climate modeling, and has continued to be a visible, active voice in mainstream climate science communication in the years since, rather than someone who faced professional consequences for having posed the question. The paper's own title borrows the term Silurian Hypothesis from a work of British science fiction, referencing an old episode of a science fiction television series, and the authors were quite explicit, both in the paper itself and in subsequent interviews, that they intended it primarily as a thought exercise about the limits of geological detectability, precisely to sharpen thinking about what evidence would even look like, rather than as a serious proposal that such a civilization actually existed. Understanding it this way, as a genuinely useful and reasonably well-received thought experiment rather than a suppressed discovery, gives a much more accurate picture of how this particular corner of science has actually unfolded, threaded through everything we've covered tonight is a quieter theme worth naming directly, since it comes up again and again in the PETM's slowly narrowing carbon budget, in the ongoing back and forth over the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, in the careful, still developing interpretation of the carvings at Göbekli Tepe. It's the question of how scientific consensus actually forms, and how long it reasonably takes. New ideas in science typically start as a hypothesis proposed by one research group, based on some initial body of evidence. From there, the idea gets tested by other, independent teams, who often try quite deliberately to find flaws in it, to replicate the findings using different methods or different samples, or to propose alternative explanations for the same evidence. This process can take years, sometimes decades, particularly for questions involving events that happened millions of years ago and evidence that requires expensive, specialized fieldwork and laboratory analysis to gather in the first place. A hypothesis that survives this sustained scrutiny, accumulating supporting evidence from multiple independent sources using multiple different methods, gradually earns broader acceptance. A hypothesis that fails to replicate, or that turns out to have simpler alternative explanations once tested further, gradually falls out of favor, sometimes without any single dramatic moment of refutation, just a slow accumulation of researchers finding it less useful or less well supported than competing explanations. This, is exactly why the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis remains a minority position after roughly 2 decades of active research and counter-research, not because of any reluctance to consider dramatic possibilities, but because the specific physical evidence claimed in its support has faced genuine, ongoing difficulty being consistently replicated across independent research teams. It's also why the PETM's carbon budget question remains open after 30 years, not because of any institutional unwillingness to pursue the answer, but because getting a truly precise handle on volcanic output, methane release rates, and feedback strengths from 56 million years ago is a genuinely difficult measurement problem, one that continues to improve gradually as better sediment cores, better dating techniques, and better climate models become available. Science, especially the parts of it dealing with events this far in the past, tends to move at the pace of careful, repeated measurement rather than the pace of a satisfying story. And that slower pace, however unglamorous, is really the whole reason we can trust the parts of the picture that have become settled. The reality of the PETM itself, the reality of ice ages and their orbital pacing, the reality of the Chicxulub impact as solidly as we do. Since we spent real time earlier discussing the Chicxulub impact and its role in ending the age of the dinosaurs, it's worth mentioning that modern science has moved well beyond simply studying past impacts and into actively working to prevent future ones, which feels like a fittingly hopeful, practical note to add to that part of the story. Space agencies around the world now maintain ongoing survey programs that scan the sky for near-Earth objects, asteroids and comets whose orbits bring them close to our planet, cataloging their size, trajectory, and any potential future risk of impact decades or centuries in advance. In September of 2022, NASA carried out an experiment called the Double Asteroid Redirection Test, deliberately crashing a spacecraft into a small asteroid moon called Dimorphos, orbiting a larger asteroid called Didymos, neither of which posed any actual threat to Earth, specifically to measure how much such a collision could alter an asteroid's orbit. The impact successfully shortened Dimorphos's orbital period by over 30 minutes, considerably more than mission planners had expected, demonstrating for the first time that a spacecraft impact could meaningfully and predictably change the path of an asteroid. A genuinely reassuring proof of concept for planetary defense. Should a genuinely hazardous object ever be identified heading toward Earth in the future, it's a nice, concrete example of how understanding a dramatic event from the deep past, like Chicxulub, has fed directly into practical, ongoing efforts to make sure a similar event doesn't get the chance to happen again, since we spent time earlier on the Drake equation and the general question of civilizational detectability. It's worth briefly mentioning the actual, real-world search efforts connected to that question, since they're a nice, concrete counterpart to all the more theoretical reasoning we've covered tonight. In 1960, the same Frank Drake who later proposed the equation carried out the first modern search for radio signals from other civilizations. A project called OSMA, using a radio telescope in West Virginia to listen briefly toward to nearby sun-like stars for any signal that might stand out from natural background noise. Nothing was found, but the project established the basic template that later searches would follow, listening across various ranges of radio frequencies for narrow, artificial-looking signals that would be unlikely to arise from any known natural astrophysical process. Since then, this general effort, usually referred to as the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, or SETI, has continued in various forms. including long-running work at the Arecibo Observatory in Puerto Rico before its collapse in 2020, and a more recent, substantially funded effort called Breakthrough Listen, launched in 2015, which uses powerful radio telescopes, including the Green Bank Telescope in West Virginia and others, to systematically survey a large number of nearby star systems and scan much of the radio spectrum for any signal that might indicate artificial origin. As of now, no confirmed signal of this kind has ever been detected, a result that is itself treated as scientifically informative, since it helps refine estimates for how common, powerful, or long-lasting broadcasting civilizations might be within the range these searches have covered so far, which remains a relatively small slice of the galaxy and a fairly narrow range of possible signal types. More recently, some researchers have also begun exploring what are sometimes called technosignatures beyond radio waves, looking for indirect evidence of technology through other means, including unusual patterns of light from distant stars that might indicate large-scale structures, or particular combinations of atmospheric gases on distant exoplanets that would be difficult to produce without industrial activity. Observations that have become newly possible with instruments like the James Webb Space Telescope, which can analyze the chemical composition of some exoplanet atmospheres in careful detail. This broader search effort, patient, methodical, mostly turning up negative results so far, sits as a nice real-world companion to the more purely theoretical reasoning in the Schmidt and Frank paper. Both approaches, in their own way, are simply trying to work out, carefully and honestly, what we would actually be able to notice if there were something out there to notice at all, whether across the galaxy or across our own planet's deep past. So where does all of this actually leave us? Tonight, with everything laid out calmly and in order, the PETM remains real, well documented, and still not completely explained down to the last detail. Scientists know it happened, know roughly how much carbon was involved, know it carries a biological isotopic signature, and know it caused significant warming and ocean disruption before the planet slowly recovered. What remains genuinely open is the precise accounting of how much came from volcanism, how much from methane release, and how much from other feedback processes. A question that continued drilling expeditions, refined climate models, and newly analyzed sediment core are gradually narrowing, without any indication that the answer requires anything beyond those known. Natural mechanisms. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis remains a genuinely contested, actively researched question, with dedicated scientists on both sides continuing to gather and analyze evidence, including ongoing searches for additional sites, refined dating of existing samples, and continued scrutiny of whether the reported nanodaemons and spherules hold up under further independent testing. It may eventually be confirmed with much stronger evidence, refined into something more modest, or gradually set aside in favor of the meltwater explanation alone. And honestly, right now, it's reasonable to hold that question loosely and watch how the evidence develops over the coming years. Göbekli Tepe and its sister sites continue to be excavated slowly and carefully, with only a portion of the known site currently uncovered, and researchers continue to refine their understanding of exactly why it was built, how labor was organized, and what its carvings meant to the people who made them. Questions that ongoing fieldwork, continued genetic studies of early domesticated crops in the region, and further comparison with newly discovered nearby sites will likely continue to illuminate for years to come. And the parallel between the PETM and our own current moment of rapid biologically sourced carbon release remains one of the more genuinely useful natural laboratories available to climate science. A real, physical instance of a warming, acidifying ocean system that has already played out once, continuing to inform current climate models and current thinking about tipping points and feedback loops. Through careful, ongoing research at ocean drilling sites, ice core stations, and climate modeling centers around the world, none of these open questions need to be dramatic to be worth caring about. They're simply the honest, unfinished edges of a much larger picture that has already been filled in with a remarkable amount of solid, patient, cross-checked work going back centuries. From Agassiz noticing scratched rocks in the Alps, to Kennett and Stott noticing an unusual isotope spike in seafloor cores, to Klaus Schmidt carefully brushing away soil to reveal a carved pillar that had been waiting quietly for 11,000 years. The record is still being read. Slowly, the way it always has been, one core sample and one carefully excavated layer at a time. There's no need to rush it, and no need for anything to be more dramatic than it already quietly is, somewhere out past the window. Wherever you happen to be right now, the ground beneath the world is still doing the same patient thing it has always done, keeping a record, layer by layer, of whatever happens to be happening. It doesn't need an audience to keep doing that. It will simply keep going, the way it always has, long after tonight, long after all of this. And for now, that's a fairly good place to let the mind rest. The record's still being written, one quiet layer at a time, patient as it has always been, patient as it will keep on being, long after the lights go down tonight, long after this particular voice has stopped talking, and long after whatever is listening right now has drifted off somewhere, quieter and far more restful than any rock layer could ever be.